On the 16th of December, 1944, the Belgian ghost front melted away under the fire of German artillery. Lieutenant Lyle Bouck stood on a frozen ridge above Lanzerath. He knew his only armored support was fleeing in panic from 500 elite German paratroopers. The phone lines were cut. The order left no hope. Hold at all costs a position blocking a mountain pass that 1,000 men wouldn't be enough to defend. And there were 18 of them. Young recruits, college kids fresh out of school, transferred after training to the Green Division because of the unit's inexperience. And when the metallic click of a heavy machine gun being cocked echoed through the frozen air, Bouck raised his hand, signaling the start of the defense. The longest day of their lives was just beginning. This one gave me chills writing it, and I hope it does the same for you. Links down in the description. Get cozy, subscribe, and let's go. The brick building in Hüningen still held the warmth of the homemade stove when First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck Jr. received the order on December 10th. 20 years old, one of the youngest officers in the Army. He stood in the basement surrounded by his men, the smell of roasting potatoes mixing with cigarette smoke and the metallic tang of gun oil. The intelligence and reconnaissance platoon of the 394th Regiment had made this place home for weeks now. 18 men who'd learned to supplement their sea rations with whatever the Belgian countryside offered. Most of them were former ASTP students, plucked from college classrooms and thrust into a war they'd studied in theory. The Army's specialized training program had promised them specialized education. Instead, they'd found themselves in the 99th Infantry Division, green as spring grass, holding a 20-mile stretch of the Ardennes that doctrine said should take 3 divisions to defend properly. The men called themselves the Battle Babies. The Germans, Bouck suspected, called this sector something else entirely. 6 miles southeast, Major Robert Kriz had said, his fingers stabbing at the map. Lanzerath, 23 houses and a church. You'll be plugging a 5-mile gap between the 106th and us. 5 miles. Bouck had studied the terrain, the way the narrow valley of the Losheim Gap funneled through the hills like a corridor built for invasion. In 1940, the Germans had come through here in 3 days. Now, in the dead of winter, the same ground waited beneath snow and fog. The only reserve was 3rd Battalion at Buchholz Station, miles to the rear. The only thing between the German border and the vital road networks behind them would be his 18 men. They'd moved out the next morning, jeeps grinding through frost-hardened ruts, and found the positions the 2nd Infantry Division had left behind. A ridgeline northwest of Lanzerath, just inside the tree line, overlooking a pasture bisected by a 4-foot barbed wire fence. The foxholes were there, shallow scrapes in the frozen earth that spoke of men who hadn't expected to stay long. Bouck's men had made them deeper. For days they'd worked, 2 or 3 men to a hole, digging until each position could shelter them standing, then covering the tops with pine logs 8 to 12 inches thick. The snow had come and buried their work, leaving the fortifications invisible from the road below. They'd interlocked fields of fire the way the manual said, positioned a light .30 caliber machine gun, augmented their standard kit with extra carbines and 2 Browning automatic rifles. Bouck had even traded a collection of German souvenirs to a supply officer for an armored jeep mounting a .50 caliber machine gun. The kind of firepower that could make 18 men sound like 50. The jeep sat in its own emplacement now, the heavy gun positioned to rake the road in enfilade. Every hour, they ran a patrol up and down the line, maintaining contact with the units on their flanks, watching for movement. The Ghost Front, they called this sector. Quiet. Too quiet. We weren't trained to occupy a defensive position. Bouck had told Sergeant William Slape that first night, both of them standing outside the warming hut they'd claimed behind the ridge. were supposed to patrol, gather intelligence. Slape, who'd been with him on every raid behind enemy lines as far as Losheim, 2 miles deep into German-held territory, just nodded. They'd both earned their combat infantry badges on those missions, creeping through snow-clogged defiles in the fog, fixing enemy positions, sometimes bringing back prisoners for interrogation. This static defense felt wrong, like waiting for a punch you could see coming but couldn't dodge. Below them, Lanzerath huddled in the valley, smoke rising from chimneys into the gray December sky. The temperature hung around freezing during the day, dropped into the low 20s at night. The men rotated through the warming hut, never all at once, never long enough to lose their edge. They ate from cans heated over small fires, rationed their cigarettes, and listened. General Walter Lauer, commanding the 99th Division, knew his front was too long, too thin. He'd ordered every unit to dig in, build cover, prepare for the worst. General Leonard Garrow, running 5th Corps, had recognized this gap south of Losheimer Graben as a possible avenue of attack. But intelligence had missed something. Missed the movement of hundreds of armored vehicles, tens of thousands of infantry, the vast machinery of a final German offensive assembling just beyond the tree line. On the night of December 15th, Bouck heard it. The clanking of armor, the low rumble of engines in the distance, muffled by snow and darkness. He ordered his men to stay awake, passed the word from foxhole to foxhole. Private First Class Risto Milosevic, manning the .50 caliber, checked his ammunition belts twice. Technical Sergeant Slape cleaned his rifle again, the bolt clicking in the cold. The sounds continued, mechanical and ominous, like the breathing of some vast creature gathering itself in the dark. Bouck stood at the edge of the tree line, looking down at the village, then back toward the invisible German positions. His breath frosted in the air. Somewhere behind him, miles away, the 2nd Infantry Division was attacking the Roer River dams, punching through the west wall at Wallerscheid. The battle-hardened 2nd doing what they did best. His Green Division, his Green Platoon, holding this crucial gap with nothing but determination and the hope that someone, somewhere, remembered they were here. The Losheim Gap, 5 miles wide, the only road network in this border region that could support a major offensive. He'd studied the maps enough to know what it meant if the Germans came through here. Not just a local counterattack, something bigger. In his foxhole, Private James Fort adjusted the SCR 300 radio, checking the frequencies one more time. The SCR 284 sat mounted in one of the jeeps, ready for longer-range communication. They had contact with regiment at Hunningen, tenuous but real. As long as that held, they weren't alone. But as Bouck settled into his own position, the sounds of German armor still echoing across the frozen valley, he knew the truth. 5 miles of front line, 18 men. When morning came, whatever was out there in the darkness would reveal itself. And there would be no one to help them but each other. The temperature dropped. The stars disappeared behind clouds. In the warming hut, someone had scratched a date on the wooden wall. December 16th, 1944. Tomorrow was going to be different. Bouck jerked awake in his foxhole, the earth convulsing beneath him as the first salvo landed. Not close. The Germans were firing long, wide, short, searching for targets they couldn't see in the pre-dawn darkness. But the volume was staggering. He'd heard artillery before, but this was different. This was methodical destruction, a rolling thunder that stretched from horizon to horizon. "Stay down," he shouted, though his voice disappeared in the cacophony. Around him, the forest erupted in geysers of frozen earth and shattered timber. Shells burst in the treetops, sending steel and wooden shrapnel slicing downward into positions that would have been death traps for anyone caught above ground. The logs covering their foxholes shuddered with each impact, dirt sifting through gaps to powder their shoulders and helmets. 90 minutes. The bombardment continued for 90 minutes without pause. 1,600 German guns hammering an 80-mile front with everything they had. Bouck pressed himself against the frozen wall of his hole and tried to count the seconds between impacts. There were no seconds, just continuous thunder. When the shelling finally lifted, the silence felt wrong, broken only by the ringing in his ears and the crackle of fires in the shattered trees. Bouck hauled himself up, checking his men. Miraculously, the reinforced positions had held. No casualties. The logs had done their job. But the telephone wire to regiment was gone, cut somewhere in the darkness by flying steel. Only the SCR-300 remained, the backpack radio that Private Fort was already checking with shaking hands. "Get me regiment," Bouck ordered. The radio crackled to life. Through the static, he heard the distant sound of explosions, small arms fire. Not just here, everywhere. Buchholz Station, Losheimer Graben. The whole front was coming apart. Then came the roar of engines from Lanzerath below. Bouck grabbed his binoculars and moved to the observation position at the edge of the tree line. Through the gray morning light, he saw them. Tank destroyers from the 820 TD Battalion, pulling out of the village in a cloud of diesel smoke, their tracks chewing up the frozen road as they fled west. Nobody had told them to go. Nobody had told Bouck they were leaving. He keyed the radio. "This is I and our platoon. The TDs are pulling out. What are our orders?" The response came through waves of interference, but the words were clear enough. "Hold at all costs. 3rd Battalion is moving up to support. Hold at all costs." Bouck stared at the radio, then back at his 18 men. 3rd Battalion was miles away at Buchholz Station, and from the sounds on the radio net, they had their own problems. "Slape, James, Krieger," he called. "With me. We're going down to the village for a better look." The 4 of them moved through the thinning smoke, weapons ready, keeping to the tree line until they reached one of the stone houses at the edge of Lanzerath. The building was empty, the civilians long gone. Bouck climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, glass crunching under his boots from blown-out windows. Through his binoculars, he saw them coming. A column of infantry, roughly 500 strong, advancing from the east in a loose formation that spoke of training and discipline. They wore the distinctive helmets that made his blood run cold. Fallschirmjäger, German paratroopers, elite troops from the 3rd Parachute Division, the same unit that had been shattered in the Falaise pocket and rebuilt with Luftwaffe field regiments. Young men, many of them, no older than Bouck himself. Some had never fired a shot in combat. But they carried the new STG-44 assault rifles, and they moved with purpose. Behind them, somewhere in the murk, was something bigger. Bouck had heard the intelligence reports, dismissed as unlikely. A Kampfgruppe from 1st SS Panzer Division, 4,800 men and 600 vehicles under the command of an SS lieutenant colonel named Joachim Piper, 29 years old, a veteran of the Eastern Front, with a reputation for speed and brutality. But Piper's forces were stuck miles to the east, bottled up behind blown bridges and a traffic jam that stretched back to the German border. The Losheim Gap, the only route that could support armor, was blocked. Which meant if Bouck's platoon could hold this ridge, hold this single crossroads, they might buy time for the chaos behind them to sort itself into something resembling a defense. He keyed the radio again. "I and R to regiment. I count approximately 500 enemy infantry, Fallschirmjäger, moving on our position from the east. Request permission to conduct a fighting withdrawal. Static, then. Negative. Hold your position. 3rd Battalion is en route. Bouck looked at Slape, saw his own thoughts reflected in the sergeant's face. 3rd Battalion wasn't coming. Not in time. Maybe not at all. Sir, Krieger said quietly, pointing down at the pasture below the ridge. The German column had stopped at the barbed wire fence, 4 feet high, that bisected the open ground. They were forming up, organizing themselves for an assault. Officers shouting orders, soldiers checking weapons. In the warming hut behind the American lines, the rest of the platoon waited. Milosevic on the 50 caliber, McGeehee with the 30 caliber machine gun, Robinson, Silvola, Jenkins, Preston, all of them former college students who'd been promised technical training and instead got this. A frozen ridge in Belgium, with 500 German paratroopers about to come up the hill. Bouck made his way back to the platoon position, staying low, using the trees for cover. The men watched him approach, reading his expression. "They're coming," he said simply. 500, maybe more. Fallschirmjäger. Nobody spoke. What was there to say? The math was obvious. 28 to 1 odds. No support, no way out. "We've got good positions," Bouck continued, keeping his voice level. "Interlocking fire. Surprise. They don't know we're here yet. When they come through that wire, we make every shot count." Slape chambered around in his M1. "How long do we hold?" "Until 3rd Battalion arrives." Bouck paused. "Or until we can't hold anymore." Private Ford adjusted the radio frequency, maintaining contact with regiment. The backpack unit crackled with traffic from up and down the line. Units reporting contact, calling for support, some just screaming into the void. The whole northern shoulder of the German offensive was collapsing. And somewhere in the chaos, someone had decided that this single platoon would make it stand here, in these snow-covered foxholes. Against odds that would have seemed absurd in any tactical problem back at training. The sun rose higher, burning through the morning fog. In the pasture below, the German column began to move. Bouck watched through his binoculars, counting. 12 men, moving in a textbook infantry advance, 1 fire team providing cover while the other maneuvered. They thought they were alone out there, walking into empty country. The snow-covered foxholes gave away nothing. The forest remained silent. "Hold fire," Bouck whispered into the stillness. The order passed down the line in hushed repetition. "Hold fire, hold fire." 800 yards. The Germans reached the fence, began working on the wire with cutters. More squads emerged from the tree line behind them, spreading out across the pasture in a skirmish line. 50 men. 70. 100. The morning light caught on their helmets, their distinctive Fallschirmjäger smocks. 600 yards. Bouck's hand tightened on his carbine. Behind him, he heard the metallic click of Milosevic, charging the 50 caliber, the sound impossibly loud in the frozen air. The Germans kept coming, confident, casual almost. Young men who'd been told the Americans were undisciplined, weak, that they'd break at the first real pressure. 400 yards. "Now," Bouck said. The ridge erupted. Milosevic opened up with the 50 caliber, the heavy gun hammering out a rhythm that shook the earth. The big half-inch rounds tore through the morning air with a sound like canvas ripping, finding targets in the exposed German infantry. Bodies jerked and fell. The bar opened up next, then the 30 caliber, then the crack, crack, crack of 18 M1 Garands firing as fast as trained men could pull triggers. The Germans went down in rows, caught in the open with nowhere to hide. The survivors threw themselves flat, returning fire blindly at muzzle flashes they couldn't locate. The snow around the American positions kicked up in small geysers as German bullets searched for targets, but the log-covered foxholes held. "Adjust fire left," Bouck shouted over the din. "They're flanking." A German squad was trying to work around through a fold in the ground, using the terrain for cover. McGeehee swung the .30 caliber, walked the fire across the snow until the flanking movement collapsed in a tangle of fallen bodies and abandoned equipment. The firing slackened. Smoke drifted across the pasture, mixing with the fog. Through his binoculars, Bouck counted the still forms in the snow. 20, maybe 30. The rest had pulled back to the tree line, dragging their wounded. "Check ammunition," he ordered. The men reported back. Still good, still plenty. The volume of fire had been devastating, but they'd been selective, making shots count. This was what all those hours on the range had bought them. 15 minutes passed. Then the Germans came again. This time they knew where the Americans were. Artillery rounds began falling on the ridge. Not the massed barrage from the morning, but targeted fire, trying to suppress the defensive positions. Shells burst in the trees above, sending shrapnel whistling through the branches. One round landed 10 feet from Bouck's foxhole, showering him with frozen earth and pine needles. The German infantry advanced under the covering fire, moving faster now, using proper fire and maneuver. Bouck saw an officer waving them forward, screaming orders. The man went down as Slape's M1 barked once, twice. But the momentum was building. The Germans had numbers, and they were using them. "Fort, get regiment," Bouck yelled over the chaos. "Tell them we need artillery support, grid coordinates." The radio operator was already on it, shouting into the handset, trying to make himself heard over the small arms fire and the crash of incoming shells. Through the noise, Bouck heard the response. Artillery was engaged elsewhere. All available guns firing to support the collapsing front at Losheimer Graben, at Buchholz Station, at a dozen other positions along the northern shoulder. They were on their own. The second assault reached the wire. This time the Germans had brought Bangalore torpedoes, long tubes of explosive meant to blast through obstacles. The first charge detonated with a flat crack that sent barbed wires spiraling through the air. A gap appeared in the fence. "Focus fire on the breach," Bouck commanded. Milosevic poured 50 caliber rounds into the gap, the big gun bucking against its mount. German bodies piled up at the opening, but more kept coming, climbing over their own dead to push through. Some made it 50 yards beyond the wire before the overlapping fields of fire from the foxholes cut them down, but they were getting closer. ASTG-44 stuttered from the German lines, the new assault rifle's distinctive sound cutting through the battle noise. Rounds stitched across the front of Bouck's position, forcing him down. When he raised his head again, he saw Germans in the pasture within 300 yards, setting up a machine gun position. "James, suppress that gun." William James, who'd changed his name from Tsakanikas and had been pushing for a Medal of Honor that would never come, shifted his fire. His M1 cracked steadily, methodically, keeping the German gun crew pinned. Robinson joined him, then Silvola, 3 rifles working in concert to deny the enemy their support weapon. The machine gun never got into action. Third assault. Fourth. The Germans kept coming, wave after wave, pushing through the gaps in the wire, advancing across ground slick with blood and churned snow. Each time they got a little closer before the American fire drove them back. Each time they left more bodies in the pasture. Bouck's shoulder ached from the carbine's recoil. His ears rang from the continuous gunfire. The smell of cordite hung thick in the air, mixing with the sharper scent of burning wood from trees set alight by tracer rounds. Spent brass littered the floor of his foxhole, clinking as he shifted position. "I'm down to my last belt," Milosevic called from the .50 caliber position. "Make it count," Bouck replied, trying to sound calmer than he felt. The Germans pulled back again, but this time they didn't go far. They were setting up a base of fire, positioning multiple machine guns in the tree line. Bouck could see officers moving among the men, reorganizing, preparing for another push. These weren't the green troops he'd expected. These were Fallschirmjäger, and they fought like it. A runner appeared at Bouck's foxhole, Private Preston, crawling up from McGeehee's position. .30 caliber is jammed. McGeehee's working on it. Bouck nodded. "Tell him to take his time. Do it right." The ridge had gone quiet again, except for the crackle of burning wood and the occasional shot from a German sniper trying to keep them pinned. Bouck used the lull to check on his men, moving from position to position in a low crouch. Jenkins was bleeding from a fragment wound to his shoulder, but still firing. Krieger was pale but steady, feeding ammunition to the BAR. Fort had the radio pressed to his ear, maintaining contact with regiment even though the news kept getting worse. "Sir," Fort said as Bouck passed. "3rd Battalion is pinned down at Buchholz. They're not coming." Bouck had known, but hearing it confirmed hit differently. "Acknowledged. Keep the link open." Back at his position, he took stock. They'd stopped 5 assaults. The Germans had to have taken over 100 casualties, maybe more. But the math was relentless. The enemy had 500 men. Bouck had 18. Attrition favored the side with numbers. The German artillery started up again, more concentrated this time. They'd gotten the range, and shells began landing closer to the American foxholes. One hit behind Robinson's position, the explosion picking the man up and slamming him against the log cover. He crawled out shaking, ears bleeding, but alive. "Here they come," Slape said quietly. Through the smoke and snow, Bouck saw them forming up for another assault. More men this time, at least 2 companies. The Germans had committed to taking this ridge, whatever the cost. They needed this road. They needed to open the Losheim Gap for Piper's armor, waiting somewhere behind them in the traffic-choked roads. Bouck checked his ammunition. 2 magazines left for the carbine. He looked at his men, saw the same calculation happening in foxholes up and down the line. They'd fought all morning. They'd bled the German attack white. But eventually, the numbers would tell. The German infantry stepped off, moving toward the wire in a human wave. Milosevic opened fire. The Germans came in rushes now, not organized waves, but desperate surges of men trying to overwhelm the American position through sheer mass. Bouck's platoon had become a machine, each man locked into his sector of fire, shooting, reloading, shooting again. The rhythm of it had taken on a terrible automaticity. The barrel of Milosevic's .50 caliber glowed dull red, despite the December cold. "Ammunition check," Bouck called during a lull. The reports came back grim. McGeehee's .30 caliber was down to 200 rounds. The bar had 1 magazine left. Most of the riflemen were scavenging from the dead and wounded. Bouck himself had switched to a captured German rifle when his carbine ammunition ran out. The unfamiliar weight of the Mauser strange in his hands. The pasture below had transformed into an abattoir. Bodies lay in heaps at the wire, in the snow, scattered across the open ground where American fire had caught them. Bouck estimated over 200 German casualties, possibly more. The surviving Fallschirmjäger had stopped trying to retrieve their wounded. The men in gray-green camouflage just kept coming, stepping over their fallen comrades, driven forward by officers who knew that somewhere behind them Kampfgruppe Piper waited for this road to open. Then the mortars started. Not the random harassment fire from earlier, but concentrated barrages that walked up and down the ridgeline with methodical precision. The Germans had finally gotten forward observers into position, and they were calling in fire with deadly accuracy. Shells burst in the trees, in the foxholes, searching for the Americans who had made this ridge so costly. A round landed directly on the warming hut. The structure disintegrated in a flash of splintered wood and roofing tiles. Bouck felt the concussion from 50 yards away, the pressure wave slapping him back against the frozen earth. "Anyone in there?" Slape shouted. "Empty," someone called back. "We're all on the line." But the near miss had done its work. The men were shaken. Bouck could see it in their faces when he looked around, the 1,000-yard stares starting to form, the mechanical movements of soldiers running on empty. They'd been in continuous combat for 7 hours without relief, without support. Watching the German tide lap closer with each assault. Fort crawled up to Bouck's position, the radio handset trailing its cord. "Regiment wants a status report." "Tell them we've held," Bouck said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "Enemy strength approximately 300 remaining, casualties heavy on both sides. We need ammunition and reinforcement." Fort spoke into the radio, listened, then shook his head. "They say hold at all costs. 3rd Battalion is still engaged at Buchholz. No reserves available." Through the smoke and snow, Bouck saw movement in the German lines. Not another assault forming up, something different. Vehicles. The distinctive growl of diesel engines. His stomach dropped as the first shape emerged from the trees. A Stug 3 assault gun, its long 75mm cannon already traversing toward the American positions. Behind it came another. Then another. 4 assault guns total, moving in a line with infantry following. "Armor!" The cry went up along the ridge. Men who'd faced human waves all morning now stared at steel monsters that their small arms couldn't touch. The .50 caliber might penetrate the thinner side armor at close range, but these were assault guns, built to absorb punishment. Bouck grabbed the radio himself. "I&R to any artillery. We have armor on our position. Grid coordinates, negative, I&R." The response crackled back. "All artillery is engaged. You're to fall back to Buchholz Station." "Fall back?" Bouck stared at the handset. "Through 400 yards of open ground with armor on our position?" "Those are the orders, Lieutenant." Bouck looked at his men. At Jenkins, still bleeding from his shoulder wound. At Robinson, concussed from the near miss. At Milosevic, who'd been firing the .50 caliber for 7 hours straight until his hands were raw. At the college boys who'd become soldiers in these frozen foxholes. The assault guns fired. The 75mm rounds slammed into the ridgeline with flat cracks that dwarfed anything the mortars had delivered. Trees exploded into splinters. A direct hit on one foxhole sent 2 men tumbling out, one dead, one screaming with a shattered leg. The first casualties from the platoon since the fighting began. "We can't stay here," Slape said, crawling up beside Bouck. The sergeant's face was black with powder residue, his eyes red-rimmed. "Those guns will tear us apart." Bouck knew he was right. But he also knew what lay behind them. Miles of disorganized retreat, units streaming west in disorder, the entire northern shoulder of the offensive collapsing. This ridge, this single crossroads at Lanzerath, was the only thing holding up the German timetable. If Kampfgruppe Piper got through here, got into the American rear with his tanks and half-tracks. Another round from the assault guns hit McGeehee's position. The .30 caliber machine gun flew into the air, the gun shield peeled back like tinfoil. McGeehee crawled out of the wreckage, blood streaming from his nose, but the gun was finished. "Lieutenant, we have to go," Ford urged. Now, while they're repositioning, the assault guns had stopped to let their infantry catch up. A brief window, maybe 3 minutes before the next combined assault. Bouck looked down at Lanzerath village, at the road that wound through it toward Buchholz station. 400 yards of open ground. Maybe they'd make it. Maybe. Then he saw the half-tracks. They emerged from the east side of the village, 5KFZ, 251S, with their distinctive sloped armor, each one carrying a squad of panzer grenadiers. Not Fallschirmjäger anymore. These were Waffen-SS, the vanguard of Piper's column finally reaching Lanzerath after being stuck in the traffic behind blown bridges and narrow roads. The half-tracks spread out, engines growling, machine guns mounted on their decks sweeping the ridge. Any retreat would run straight into them. "We're cut off," Bouck said quietly. Slape saw it too. The sergeant's jaw tightened. "So what do we do?" Bouck looked at his platoon. 17 men left after the casualties from the assault gun fire. 17 exhausted, ammunition-depleted soldiers against the leading edge of an SS Kampfgruppe. The math was simple. Suicidal. "We keep fighting," he said. "Make them pay for every yard." The German infantry began advancing again, this time with the assault guns moving in support, their turrets traversing to suppress any defensive fire. The half-tracks closed from the south, converging on the ridge. The platoon was in a vise, and it was closing. Milosevic got the .50 caliber working again, fired a burst at the nearest assault gun. The round sparked off the armor uselessly. He shifted fire to the infantry following behind, dropped 2 men before return. Fire forced him down. The first assault gun reached 200 yards. Its cannon fired, the shells screaming past Bouck's position to detonate somewhere behind the line. The second shot hit Fort's foxhole. The radio operator and his equipment vanished in the explosion. The SCR-300 transformed into twisted metal and scattered components. No more contact with regiment. No more calls for support that wasn't coming anyway. Bouck fired the captured Mauser at the advancing infantry, worked the bolt, fired again. The stock bruised his shoulder. Around him, the platoon's fire had slackened to sporadic shots as ammunition ran critically low. Men were down to 5 rounds, 3 rounds, single magazines. A half-track broke through the southern perimeter, its machine gun raking the American positions. Krieger stood up with the BAR to engage it, got off one burst before German fire cut him down. He fell back into his foxhole, the BAR clattering away. "Medic!" someone shouted, but there was no medic. They were a recon platoon, not a line unit. The wounded would have to wait. The assault guns were at 100 yards now, close enough that Bouck could see the commanders in their hatches, directing fire. The infantry had gone to ground, waiting for the armor to finish the job. The half-tracks were fanning out, encircling the position. Slape crawled to Bouck's foxhole, blood running down his face from a scalp wound. "We're out of time." "I know. We could surrender, save the men." Bouck thought about it. Thought about the choice every commander feared, knowing when to end it, when continuing resistance meant throwing away lives for no gain. They'd held all day. They'd delayed Piper's advance by crucial hours. Maybe that was enough. An assault gun fired point-blank into the tree line, the muzzle blast setting the snow alight. The shell hit Milosevic's position. The .50 caliber went silent. "White flag," Bouck said, the words tasting like ashes. "Cease fire. White flag." Someone found a white undershirt. Slape tied it to a rifle and stood up slowly, raising it above the foxhole. The firing slackened, then stopped entirely. The silence that followed felt unnatural, broken only by the tick of cooling metal and the moans of wounded men in the snow. Bouck stood, raising his hands. Around him, the surviving members of his platoon emerged from their positions, hands up, faces black with powder residue and exhaustion. 14 men still standing, 4 wounded. Fort dead in the explosion that took the radio. The college boys who'd held a ridge against a battalion. The German infantry approached cautiously, weapons leveled, not quite believing what they were seeing. When they got close enough to count the foxholes, to see the ammunition scattered around the positions, their expressions changed from triumph to something closer to respect. 14 Americans. They'd been fighting 14 Americans all day. An SS officer appeared, young and hard-faced, pistol drawn. He barked orders in German, gesturing for the Americans to move down from the ridge. Bouck recognized the shoulder boards. An Obersturmführer, a first lieutenant like himself, though this man had the bearing of someone who'd seen far more combat. "How many?" the officer asked in accented English, gesturing at the platoon. 18, Bouck replied, his voice steady despite everything. "We started with 18. The German looked at him, and then at the pasture below scattered with bodies, then back. 18. He repeated it like he couldn't quite process the number. His men were already moving among the American positions, checking the foxholes, examining the reinforced logs, the interlocking fields of fire. One pointed at the destroyed .50 caliber, speaking rapidly in German. Another stood at the edge of the tree line, looking down at the wire, at the killing ground the Americans had created. They marched the prisoners down into Lanzerath village. Bouck walked at the head of the column, watching his men stumble on numb feet, some supporting the wounded. Jenkins had his shoulder roughly bandaged by a German medic who'd appeared from somewhere. Robinson walked with his head tilted, still dazed from the concussion. Milosevic had burns on his hands from the .50 caliber barrel. In the village square, more SS troops waited. Kampfgruppe Piper, finally through the gap the platoon had held all day. The half-tracks sat in neat rows, their commanders smoking cigarettes and checking maps. Kubelwagons and motorcycles filled the narrow streets. Everywhere Bouck looked, he saw the SS runes, the distinctive camouflage of elite troops who'd been waiting hours for this road to open. They separated the officers from the enlisted men. Bouck, along with the 4 artillery observers who'd been attached to his platoon, was taken to a stone house near the church. Inside, sitting at a rough wooden table with a map spread before him, was Joachim Paper. The SS Obersturmbannführer was 29, but looked older, his face lean and hard in the lamplight. He didn't look up immediately, just studied the map, his finger tracing the road network beyond Lanzerath. When he finally raised his eyes to Bouck, the American saw something there that made him understand why this man had a reputation on the Eastern Front. "You are the commander?" Piper asked in perfect English, his accent barely noticeable. "First Lieutenant Lyle Bouck, Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon, 394th Infantry." "How many men?" 18, all told. Piper stood abruptly, the chair scraping. He moved to the window, looked out at the street where his Kampfgruppe sat idle. Burning daylight, burning precious time. 18, he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, turning back to Bouck. "You held this position all day with 18 men?" "Yes, sir." "Against the 3rd Parachute Division, against my reconnaissance elements?" "Yes, sir." Piper was silent for a long moment. Outside, Bouck could hear the rumble of engines, officers shouting orders, the metallic clank of tanks being refueled. The whole massive machinery of the German offensive, delayed for crucial hours by a single platoon on a frozen ridge. You cost me my timetable, Piper said finally. There was no anger in his voice, just statement of fact. I was supposed to be at the Meuse by now. Instead, I am here, in this village, because your 18 men decided to be heroes. We were following orders, Bouck replied. Hold at all costs. And you did. Piper returned to the table, stared at the map again. The war is lost, you know. For us. Your armies will reach Berlin eventually. But today, he tapped the map at Lanzerath. Today you may have changed when. He called for guards. 2 SS troopers entered, took Bouck by the arms. As they led him to the door, Piper spoke again. Your men fought well, Lieutenant, as soldiers. I will see they are treated accordingly. They took Bouck to a barn where the rest of his platoon had been gathered. The men sat on straw bales, guarded by half a dozen SS troops who looked at them with something between contempt and curiosity. Bouck did a quick count, everyone accounted for except Fort. The wounded had received basic medical attention, though Jenkins still looked pale from blood loss. What happens now? Slape asked quietly as Bouck sat down beside him. POW camp, I imagine, if we're lucky. And if we're not? Bouck had heard the stories. The SS didn't always play by Geneva Convention rules, especially this late in the war when they knew they were losing. But Piper had given his word, and something in the German officer's manner suggested he meant it. Night fell. Through gaps in the barn walls, Bouck watched Piper's column finally begin moving. The tanks and half-tracks grinding west through Lanzerath, heading for Buchholz Station, for Hansfeld, for the road to the Meuse that would take them through villages whose names would become synonymous with massacre in the days ahead. The platoon sat in the darkness, not speaking much. What was there to say? They'd done their job, held the ridge, delayed the enemy. Whether it mattered in the grand scheme of things, they wouldn't know until the war was over, if they lived that long. Around midnight, they loaded the prisoners onto trucks. Not the death ride Bouck had feared, but a standard prisoner transport heading east toward Germany. The men climbed aboard in silence, taking last looks at Lanzerath, at the ridge above the village where they'd made their stand. Bouck was the last to board. He turned for a moment, looking back at the dark mass of the ridge line. Somewhere up there, Fort's body lay in the ruins of his foxhole. Somewhere up there, the .50 caliber sat silent, its barrel still warm perhaps from the fire it had poured into the German assault. 18 men, a 5-mile gap in the line. One day that felt like a lifetime. The truck engine coughed to life. They drove east through the darkness, away from the sound of guns, away from the war that would continue without them. In the back of the truck, pressed together for warmth, the survivors of the intelligence and reconnaissance platoon began the journey that would take them through capture, through prison camps, through the long months until liberation. But that was another story. Tonight, they were just soldiers who'd done what soldiers do. Stand when ordered, fight when necessary, survive when possible. The truck bounced over frozen ruts, carrying them into an uncertain future. Behind them, at Lanzerath, the German offensive poured west, hours behind schedule, racing against a clock that 18 men had helped to delay. The trucks took them to Stalag 13D in Nuremberg, to the grounds where Nazi party rallies had once filled the air with torchlight and speeches. Now the massive stone structures housed 29,000 prisoners of war, crammed into barracks built for temporary party delegates, not long-term captivity. December 1944 became January 1945. The German ration, 300 grams of bread, 250 grams of potatoes, dehydrated vegetables, delivered less than 1,500 calories a day. After the first week, The sugar ran out. Then the margarine. Bouck watched his men grow hollow-eyed and gaunt, their bodies consuming themselves to stay warm in the unheated barracks. Red Cross parcels arrived in late January from Dulag Luft. 4,000 boxes that were divided and redistributed until each prisoner got maybe one full parcel a month. The contents, canned meat, chocolate, cigarettes, became currency, leverage, survival. Bouck traded his chocolate ration to a guard for news from the front. The Battle of the Bulge had been contained. The German offensive, the last great gamble, had failed. They marched west in April as the American advance closed in, 12,000 prisoners shuffling along frozen roads toward Stalag 7A. Liberation came on April 16th, when forward elements of the U.S. Army overran the camp. Bouck weighed 30 pounds less than when he'd been captured. Some of his men weighed 50 pounds less. The war in Europe ended 3 weeks later. Bouck returned to a country that had moved on while he'd been gone. The newspapers were full of stories about the Bulge, about Bastogne, about Patton's relief column, about the dramatic stand of the 101st Airborne. Nobody mentioned Lanzerath. Nobody talked about 18 men on a ridge who'd held for a day. He went back to civilian life, trying to put the war behind him. Married, had children, built a career. The memories stayed locked away, filed under experiences better left unexamined. His men scattered across the country, each dealing with what they'd seen and done in their own way. In 1965, the Army published its official history of the Ardennes campaign. Hugh M. Cole's massive volume covered the battle in exhaustive detail, except for Lanzerath. Bouck's platoon earned exactly one paragraph, a brief mention of a small unit action on the first day. That might have been the end of it, except William James read the book. James, who'd changed his name from Sakanikas, who'd manned a rifle on that frozen ridge, began making phone calls. He tracked down Bouck, who hadn't thought about Lanzerath in years, except in nightmares. The conversation was awkward at first. Two middle-aged men trying to bridge 20 years of silence. "We should have gotten recognition," James said. "What we did mattered." "We were in those foxholes trying to survive," Bouck replied. "I never thought we accomplished much." "Then you're wrong." James pushed. He wrote letters to the Army, to Congress, to anyone who would listen. In June 1966, a package arrived at Bouck's house. A silver star, mailed without ceremony. Recognition for the 20-year-old lieutenant who'd held a ridge against a battalion. No one else from the platoon received anything. It wasn't enough. James kept pushing. He contacted John S.D. Eisenhower, son of the former president, who was writing a book about the Bulge. Eisenhower interviewed Bouck extensively, and when The Bitter Woods was published, it told the story of Lanzerath in detail for the first time. Columnist Jack Anderson took up the cause, campaigning for James to receive the Medal of Honor. Congressional hearings followed. The Army Board reviewed the case. The Air Force concurred. Then the Marine Corps representative said James hadn't shown sufficient intrepidity, and the Medal of Honor recommendation died. But the hearings had accomplished something else. They'd gotten the attention of President Jimmy Carter, who signed Public Law 96-145 on December 14, 1979. A law that removed the time limitation on awards specifically for the members of Bouck's platoon. On October 26, 1981, 36 years and 10 months after the battle, 14 surviving members of the platoon gathered in Washington, D.C. Secretary of the Army, John O. Marsh, presided over the ceremony. One by one, he called their names. Presidential Unit Citation for all 18 men. Distinguished Service Cross for Bouck, Slape, James, and Milosevic. Silver Stars for Krieger, Khalil, McGehee, Robinson, and Silvola. Bronze Stars with V device for the rest. The most decorated small unit of its size in World War II. Bouck stood at attention as they pinned the medals to his chest, looking at his men. Middle-aged now, some gray-haired, wearing suits instead of uniforms. He thought about Fort, dead in the radio hole, about the ridge line at Lanzerath, about the choice he'd made to surrender when continuing to fight would have meant throwing away lives for pride. After the ceremony, reporters asked him how it felt to finally be recognized. "We were scared kids doing our job," he said. "I'm just glad the others are being honored too. That's all I ever wanted." In 2004, Alex Kershaw published The Longest Winter, documenting the platoon's stand in detail. Bouck had agreed to cooperate on one condition. "I told him other authors only wrote about me. I said I wouldn't talk to him unless he promised to write about the other men too." The book became a bestseller. Schools invited them to speak. The History Channel did a documentary. The platoon that had been forgotten for 36 years became a symbol of determination against impossible odds. On May 12, 2005, veterans of the 99th Infantry Division and residents of Lanzerath, Belgium, dedicated a memorial on the ridge. A small brass plaque next to a bench and an American flag, overlooking the pasture where it had happened. The inscription read, "Uncommon valor was a common valor. In honor and memory of all soldiers who fought here, December 16, 1944. Bouck made the trip, 80 years old, walking the ground where he'd been 20. The foxholes were gone, grown over with grass and thyme. The forest had reclaimed the ridge. But standing there, he could still hear it. The sound of Milosevic's .50 caliber, the crash of German artillery, Slape's voice calling for ammunition. "We delayed them," he said to a reporter who'd asked about the significance. Piper was supposed to be at the Meuse by nightfall. Instead, he spent the day stuck at Lanzerath. That gave the units behind us time to organize. Maybe that's what mattered. The reporter pressed, "Do you consider yourselves heroes?" Bouck thought about that. About 18 college boys turned soldiers, holding a position because those were their orders. About the choice between duty and survival, made fresh every minute for 10 hours. About Fort, who never came home. About the men standing beside him now, who'd lived with Lanzerath for 60 years, carrying it quietly until someone finally noticed. "We were soldiers," he said finally. "We did what soldiers do." The sun set over the ridge, casting long shadows across the memorial. Below, in Lanzerath village, smoke rose from chimneys, just as it had on that December morning so long ago. The war was history now, living only in memories and monuments, in stories told to grandchildren who couldn't quite imagine what it had been like. But here, on this ridge, it was still real, still present. 18 men in frozen foxholes, holding a line against an army, buying time measured in hours that changed days, weeks, months of a war's final chapter. The platoon survivors stood together as the light faded. Old men remembering when they'd been young, when history had asked them for one day, and they'd given it everything they had. That, Bouck thought, would have to be enough.